Question 1. What is silence? How can one achieve silence to be peaceful and happy? Answer. Silence is an integral state and the most peaceful state of a sadhaka or spiritual aspirant. The silence is basically wordless, thoughtless, mindless, and breathless state. On negation of breath, suspension of breath, mind is negated and silence appears. In the presence of breath, varieties of thoughts are sprouted and silence is withdrawn from the mental plane. Silence is not wordlessness, just keeping quiet is not silence. To observe mauna or keeping quiet is a primitive silence, it is outwardly silence. Absolute silence prevails when one is within the self and soul is merged in the supernal. Other modes or types of silence are just the relative silence. One can easily communicate in relative silence when the receiver is also in silence. The higher level of relative silence can produce ideas, and it can receive the thoughts or signals. In silence one can dream. A dream state is also a type of silent state. Basically, the mouth is shut but all the senses are in working state and senses are open to receive thoughts from the subconscious mind. A mute picture goes on in the mind. It is a state of relative and a temporary state of silence state. The suspension of consciousness and subconscious states only lead to the higher state of silence. It is only possible when one enters from dreamy to sushupti or deep slum state to turiya or transcendent state when mind has been negated and breath is partially suspended. In general, in the silent state all the karma indriyas, Gyan indriyas and tanmatras are made functionless. It is possible with Shuniyaka, and the state of suspension of breath is achieved. When all the indriyas or senses function less, then the mind does not react because it does not get energy since breath is suspended, and so the higher degree of relative silence prevails. In this state, there is no provocation and no objective-subjective, and no subjective-objective reactions of the mind. There is no action-reaction in the mind, and nor any subjective or objective motivation operates in the mind. It is the silence, a higher degree of relative silence. But as soon as consciousness with outside memory enters, the silence is disturbed. Also, it can be disturbed by inside subconsciousness thoughts. Any mutative horizontal breath disturbs the equilibrium of silence. Breath has multiple complex vibration patterns of the external world and it disturbs the silence to the major extent by the multiplicity of conscious thoughts. This may lead to propagating and creating the various desires that can ruin or disturb the inner developed silence partially or completely. Basically, absolute silence prevails only in the state of Samadhi and in the Turiyatita states. In other states one gets only semi-silence. By alertness, being consciousness, one can prolong relative or semi-silence by yoga practices. However, A simple breath can change the scenario of spiritual feeling, and nonsense mundane feeling can pour in mind, resulting in disturbing the silence achieved. One must understand that silence is mutative. No one can be in silence for a long duration by conscious and semi-conscious efforts. However, these are the only means to be in relative silence. Ego in the consciousness can appear by maya or illusion that brings various desires. Desires invite pleasure memories, which give rise to grow other series of desires that subsequently attack the silence very violently. This leads to change in thoughts, affects the mind, provokes it, leading to suffering both subjectively and objectively by spoiling the silence completely. On the contrary, real relative silence with consciousness, when nullified by Turiya or transcendence state, brings absolute partial silence. This state of silence continues till the soul light prevails and increases. This state of unconsciousness or unawareness under the umbrella of soul light gives the bliss of absolute silence and happiness. Soul light is above any mutation, and hence it gives real silence, the stateless state of the Absolute. Jiva is I-ness, and Jiva, accompanying the soul as Jivatma. It affects the sanity of soul, its true divine light, and hence the absolute silence cannot prevail in the presence of Jiva. Therefore, desireless attitude and rebellious attitude cannot be silenced or controlled in presence of Jiva. The silence can only be partially established if indriyas or senses are properly trained to behave like a soul, which is non-mutative, so, as the desires of jiva are temporarily dissolved. In other words, one must be Jitendriya, the winner of the dynamic desires of the senses or indriyas, to be in silence without getting provoked by any gimmick of the senses. One needs to propitiate the breath, so as to negate it by its own mercy to merge into the silence. Sadhaka must learn the art to be Pawanjaya, winner of breath, and he must be able to command the breath. Existence of breath shall be in his control to be in the zone of silence. The silence is the super commander, but it can be destroyed by any horizontal urge very easily. Alertness is to be strictly observed to prolong the silent state. There must not be any reaction because of any type of the horizontal disturbances. One should be rock-like silence. It is only possible when the aspirant is above the limitation of consciousness. Any type of consciousness in the horizontal plane, including subconsciousness, must not disturb the silence. All subjective and objective symptoms of any kind to be nullified and must be shed down. Shuniyaka and breath suspension are the most effective techniques to invite the silence. However, any horizontal breath can spoil the silence any moment. The silence zone is a very delicate and very critical zone. Prolonging or elongation of the silence in human life are really very difficult tasks, like Kurukshetra Sangrama or war. It is extremely difficult to increase the period of silence. It is just like to arrest the wind without solid boundaries. Silence cannot be achieved by physical and mental efforts. If by active conscious efforts, the silence is tried, then there are chances that one suffers in a subconscious state, and many disturbances are surfaced again and again on the conscious level from the subconscious state. Any subconscious feelings always try to disturb the silence with full vigor. So, the memory of the subconscious should be avoided by using Shuniyaka or void methods. However, it is very difficult to control the higher forces of microcosm and macrocosm and avoid them to react so as to maintain the achieved silence. One could only forcefully and consciously try such that subconscious thoughts must not make the unknown linkages to disturb the silence. Even reacting and answering the conflicting issues might disturb the achieved silence. Sometimes, one has to keep artificial outer behavior to avoid the conflicts, but inside poison of disturbances may churn more violently to create an era to destroy the inner silence. However, one must always try to get fake silence inwardly if the external conflicts are severe and beyond control, but it will be far away from the real inner silence. To live in the society, one has to become outwardly civic by keeping or observing the fake inward and outward culture of silence. However, for a long time such action and reaction of the outward conflicts cannot be avoided easily. They are very mutative. By ocean of inbuilt inner silence and philosophical inward inclination, this can be made possible. To keep silence, one must act subjectively, but objectively one must not react. To be silent, one needs to learn this art of being inact. It basically requires separating the inner world from the outer world. This is the only judicial way to be inwardly silent. The tide and waves of disturbances of the outer world must be kept on the surface, and inwardly one must be silent and calm like an ocean. This is the art of enactment to make the fortress of inward silence. Enactment is only feasible by having complete command of breath, by being consciously alert, and by controlling one's own emotions and reactions, etc. Enacting a way of control to keep silence is not easily possible for one's own kith and kin. If one is disturbed inwardly in subconsciousness, then his outward silence positively gets affected. The only way is to shield subconsciousness by all possible means and conquer over rebellious thoughts of actions or reactions to preserve silence. However, even for a highly spiritual advanced sadhaka, it is not easily possible when one's own nearest are involved. By controlling the self or own outward reactions, the inward silence is likely to be positively disturbed. But for a common worldly man with his outward reactions, the subconsciousness is not affected since he lacks sensitivity, being unrefined. But a spiritual aspirant at times affects his mental and physical health by keeping mute wordlessness and vociferous silence till he clears his subconsciousness by rebellion thoughts. This is because spirituality does not teach reactions and allows only actions, and at the same time makes a person highly sensitive. So in any active horizontal self-evolved problem or issue, a sadhaka suffers to the greatest extent, but for a common worldly man this is just a normal suffering. This is because of suppressing of natural feeling of reactions to keep the outward silence. Its reaction to the inward personality is enormous and highly critical. In short, relative silence is mutative. To be in silence, the reaction of the self must be much less from a sadhaka due to his capacity of tolerance. However, inwardly he gets disturbed because of the involvement in horizontal activities even if he follows the path of enactment. The absolute silence can only be achieved in Samadhi. In all other states and controls, one gets mutative relative silence. This is only semi-silence. For horizontal life, even this is an asset to live in peace.